A wife and primary breadwinner in her household has asked Reddit if she is wrong for threatening to make her in laws homeless if they cannot understand what working from home means. In the post, the 38-year-old explained that her husband, age 42, is semi retired due to an injury at work, and that recently his sister, her husband, and their two teenage daughters lost their home. We have a rental suite in our basement that we just use as a family area. So we agreed to let them live there, she wrote. Because I'm paranoid, I had them sign a lease, adding that she set up the lease because of horror stories I have heard about people claiming to be tenants. She explained that her husband, who is usually at home during the day, recently got the opportunity to do some consulting work, and she was working from home alone and asked her sister in law to watch their youngest child for the day. She then delegated the task to her 13-year-old son. Then she had her nap, she said, explaining that the 13-year-old came and disturbed her when the baby needed changing. I waited for my husband to get home and we discussed his family. We decided together that they needed to start paying the amount on the lease, leave or start helping around the house, she said. Now, I want to stop here for just a second. I'm going to scroll back up to the top, make sure everybody's following along here, okay? Because I know a lot of you are multitasking. Now then, we basically have the situation where, and again, out of the kindness of family members' heart, right? This woman takes in her husband's side of the family. She's taking in her in-laws, who apparently don't have a place. Now, the story does not discuss why they don't have a place. I'm assuming eviction. So you're again, I'm just assuming. I don't know. Okay. Keep in mind this article is from 2023. Okay. Hopefully they have found housing since then. Now then, so out of the kindness of her heart, she's going to take in her husband's relatives. God bless her. Now then, she tells the sister-in-law, hey, my husband finally has some consulting work he can do. And apparently he needs the consulting work because he's retired. He's retired earlier than expected because of medical issues. So she tells the sister-in-law, hey, you know what? You please watch my child. Well, the sister-in-law doesn't do that. The sister-in-law sticks it on her child. Remember, she's got teenagers, young teenagers. The sister-in-law sticks it on her child to go watch the baby. Okay. She delegates the task to her 13-year-old and she goes and has her nap. Now, keep in mind, at this particular time, okay, the assumption is that this family that's moving in with them, okay, they're not supposed to be just moochers and deadbeats. And of course, the wife is taking in, like I said, her in-laws, trying to be the good family member. How many times have you done something nice for a family member and it's just totally backfired? I'm not talking the little stuff. I'm talking like you're letting somebody move in and just totally backfires, right? So they're basically saying, hey, you know what? Sister-in-law and brother and the two kids, not really the two kids, because that's not, they're minors. Okay. Just pay up, do something. Otherwise, you're out because they don't want deadbeats on their couch. One Reddit commented, how come they both don't have a job at the same time, especially with kids napping instead of looking for a job? Where's the unemployed husband collecting unemployment? Lots of red flags that point to lazy mooches. Nothing would infuriate me more. Gotta be honest, than taking in-laws. And while I'm busy working and raising my family, okay, I got people literally napping on the couch. And when I ask them, hey, help out a little bit, they're too busy taking a nap to be bothered. The in-laws reacted by saying the poster was wrong for tricking them into signing a lease agreement and then not collecting it so I could evict them. I said that I was basically the one supporting her, and if she couldn't help, then she had to give me money or leave. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting. And I think it brings up some really interesting legal stuff. Okay. Remember, the Redditor had them sign a lease saying that they were going to pay, however much per month. They don't discuss that in the article, but a lease is signed. So the in-laws move in. And does the Redditor ever collect rent money? Nope. So the way the in-laws feel is that it was a setup. Oh, you had us sign a lease just so you could try to kick us out. Now, again, remember, no rent money was ever collected by the Redditor. And I'm not a legal person, but what happens here is kind of surprising. I think it's something we can all learn from it as a word of caution. So let's continue on. It's important to take precautions when allowing anyone to stay in your home to avoid potential legal issues. Now, my audience, we know this, okay? And we know that a lot of city, states, okay, municipalities, you got to check your own rules. It can be as little as 30 days and someone can claim legal residence in your house, okay? According to an article entitled Guest Freeloaders or Tenant, before agreeing to let someone stay with you for any length of time, make sure you understand the laws in your state so that you do not inadvertently allow your guest to become a tenant. It may be harder to get rid of your unwanted house guests if you have not taken these precautions and will likely require legal assistance. I would say it's not likely it will. Newsweek spoke to lawyer Mike Schmidt. He clarified, firstly, a lodger is someone who rents a room within a property where the owner also lives. Now, I'm going to repeat this again, okay, because he's going to tell you the difference between a lodger and a tenant. Again, I'm no legal expert. I'm learning this right along with you guys, okay? So a lodger is someone who lives in your place, and they typically rent a room, maybe rent a garage, a den, a basement, but you live there also, okay, where the owner also lives. On the other hand, a tenant rents an entire property from the owner without the owner being there. The key difference between a lodger and a tenant is the degree of control the owner has over the property. A lodger is generally given less control, and a tenant more likely is given more control, okay, with fewer house rules and restrictions. Now, I was a lodger in my early 20s when I lived in Salem. I worked at the Salem Statesman Journal newspaper, okay, and I was a lodger. I did not know I was a lodger. All I knew was I rented a room from a lady's house. Clean, very nice lady. Unfortunately, I didn't get along with her well, but I was in a different mindset. But I'm sure if I met her today, you know, she was a very nice person. I was just in a different mindset, unfortunately. So anyways, moving on with that. Okay. But I was a lodger. She basically wanted a daughter, and I wasn't in any position to be anybody's daughter because her daughter had upped and moved out of the house. And she was looking, I think, partly for a replacement daughter. And I just wanted to be a lodger somewhere and rent a room. And I don't want anybody, you know, telling me what to do and all of that stuff. I was in my mid 20s. So that's a lodger. Secondly, a lease can provide significant protection for a property owner. A lease is a legally binding contract that sets out the terms of the rental agreement between the property owner and the tenant. Now, I think most of us know that, right? A lease can cover a range of issues, including the amount of rent to be paid, the length of the tenancy, and the obligations and responsibilities of both parties. By having a lease in place, a property owner can have a greater level of control over the tenancy and can protect themselves from potential legal issues that may arise from a tenant or lodger. Now, you have to be careful because, you know, a lot of these squatting issues, you've got people claiming, oh, here's my lease, and that ain't no legal lease. So you have to be really careful. If you are wanting to be a landlord and you want to, and you need to set up a lease, I would personally, I think if you're going to be a landlord, you need an attorney. You need something to go through legal. Don't try to do it the cheap way. Okay. Print something off on legalzoom.com. Okay. No one's actually checked it. So remember, the cheap places that you can go to get your so-called lease agreement, your tenants can go to make it look like the lease is real, even though it's not. Finally, the tactic of not collecting rent to then evict lodgers is not a lawful approach to terminating a lodger's occupancy. Let me repeat that again. That is so important. The tactic of not collecting rent, which is just what the Redditor did. She never collected rent. Okay. To then evict lodgers is not a lawful approach to terminating a lodger's occupancy. In other words, you think to yourself, just like this Redditor did, well, my in-laws are coming in. She probably never really wanted them there to begin with. I'm positive of that. And we're afraid that they're actually going to just wind up parking and mooching here. So we're going to have them sign a lease. But we, as the Redditor, we are not going to enforce the lease. How are we not going to enforce it? We're not enforcing it because we're not going to collect the rent. But I'm going to just hold the lease in my back pocket so I can throw it at them anytime I want them out. It don't work that way. Now, I didn't know that. I'm sure some of you out there may not have known that either. In other words, you can't drop a lease and just do the parts of the lease that you want, just like your tenant cannot be given a lease and only pick the parts that they want. This really came as a surprise to me. I didn't know this stuff. All the things we learn reading Newsweek magazine online. Okay, so this is because the lodger is still entitled to occupy the property as long as they have been granted permission to do so. And they were granted, for those who are just hearing this, I'm now doing my own ad lib. They were granted permission because remember, the Redditor said, Hey, we have a basement here. We normally rent out the basement, but you know what? Nobody's in it right now. Go ahead and move in. Here's the lease. I would like to have known how much they were going to pay, but really that's irrelevant to the whole conversation. It's the fact that there was a lease, there was supposed to be a payment, and the Redditor failed by not fulfilling the terms of the lease. Now, I know that that may seem like, unfair, and it probably is, because you're like, look at, she's letting them live there for free. But remember, when it comes to legal contracts, this is what I'm learning, okay? You cannot pick and choose the parts that you're going to follow and then decide when you don't want that contract anymore. In other words, she doesn't want them living there anymore. We're just going to boot them out. It don't work that way. And in some ways, I think that's actually a good thing. I know it don't seem fair, okay? Because basically she's letting them live there for free and they still have tenant rights. Yes, they do. Because, and this is something I've learned, thank you to YouTube, all right? You cannot contract with someone to sign away their rights. And I learned this especially from when they do clauses like non-compete clauses. You work for a company and then that company says something like, and you can't work for another company within 50 miles for the next 10 years. A court can throw that out even though you signed it. Okay. Because a employer cannot force you to sign away your legal rights. That's why, just a quick side note here. If you guys are ever told, to sign a non-compete clause or whatever, okay, that says you can't do something within a certain mile radius, time period, or whatnot, and you have falling out with that company, you really need to check with an attorney about whether or not that contract is actually enforceable. An employer cannot have an employee sign away their rights, no more than a landlord can tell a tenant to sign away their rights. I kind of put those two together. So the lodger is still entitled to occupy the property as long as they've been granted permission to do so. And the lease proves that they were granted permission. I know it's a difficult situation. I know. And it's not always fair. Okay. I get it. Deliberately. Okay. Let me repeat that. Deliberately not collecting rent may be considered a breach of the lodger's legal rights and could lead to a claim of illegal eviction or harassment. As a trial lawyer, I strongly advise against this tactic as it could result in significant legal consequences for the property owner. Everything that I just said, family, everything I just said. You can be the most kind-hearted landlord, and go, you know what, tenants, I know you're going through a tough phase in your life. You know what? Just sign a lease that says you live here. Here's how much you're going to pay each month. But you know what? I'm not going to collect from you. I'm going to let you have Christmas off. I'm going to, whatever time period. Okay. I'm not going to collect because I know you're going through a hard time. And the tenants go, well, great. And then before you know it, the tenants are mooching off of you. And you're like, wait a minute. I've just given these tenants, let's just make it up. I've given these tenants 6 months of free rent. I want them out. You chose as the landlord not to collect the rent. You as a landlord breached your own contract. Look, I am not saying I think it's fair and I'm not saying it's right, but this is going to be one of those areas where even though, yes, the tenants are moochers and stuff, okay, sometimes we have to look at the bigger picture versus just one little incident, okay? If we look at just this one little incident, my answer would be, yeah, kick the bums out, who cares? Who cares if you collected rent or not? You were nice, you never collected it, kick the bums out. But if we look at it from a bigger legal sense and the millions of people it could impact, I hate to say it, this is going to be where I'm going to actually have to agree with the tenants' rights. Okay. They're tenants, not squatters. Squatters' rights, I don't agree with. People who break into houses and want to live there. Oh, heck no. Throw the bums out. But in this case, the landlord chose to break their own lease. Now, just imagine if we allowed landlords to break any part of the lease that they wanted, and they could still kick lawful tenants out. See? That's where the problem is. Now, if you've been following this channel, okay, I'm not for or against landlords. Okay, I'm not. To me, being a landlord, it's no different than being a business, you're a business owner, teacher, whatever, pick a field, okay? But because of the impact, the rippling impact it would have potentially against millions, not thousands, millions of renters, okay? If we allow landlords to just pick and choose, in this case, the landlord picked great for the tenant. The landlord didn't choose to collect rent. Wonderful for the tenant. But what would happen if the landlord had said, you know what? I've decided that even though it's in the rental agreement that I'm going to, make sure all your appliances are working. You know what? I'm not going to check that anymore. I'm done with checking the appliances. Now you got a tenant going, wait a minute, we're paying you rent and you're supposed to be checking the appliances. You see? When it comes to breach of contract on either side, I'm of the belief it really doesn't matter who the breach benefited. And the reason it really doesn't matter who the breach benefited is because, again, they can affect millions and millions of people in the same type of contractual situation. We cannot allow landlords to pick and choose. Are you going to collect rent by the 3rd, as your agreement says, or are you going to collect rent by the 10th? Or are you even going to collect rent at all? We cannot allow renters to say, you know what, am I going to pay rent by the 3rd? Maybe I just won't pay rent at all. You see, there need to be repercussions to make sure the contract is enforced and in place. So as much as I think it's great that the renter helped out her in-laws, okay, I do have to agree. Please don't throw the tomatoes. If you're going to do it, make sure you leave a comment because it helps the YouTube algorithm, okay? But look, the bottom line is it doesn't matter who a breach of contract helps or hurts. It was a breach of contract. And if it can be proven that it was legally that, hey, she was supposed to collect a certain amount of rent, she chose, that's the big word, she chose not to. Now she doesn't want the contract at all, so she wants to throw the bums out. It doesn't work that way. But I would definitely make moves to get them out, okay? Users on Reddit decided the woman was not in the wrong, with one reader commenting, why was the sister-in-law not job hunting rather than napping? Okay. And I totally agree. Okay. Here I am working on my computer deck. I'm on this about 4 to 6 hours a day during the summer. And to think that I would have someone napping on my couch while I'm sitting here working, producing content. No, that ain't going to happen. So she definitely needs to throw her out. But here's the thing. Whether or not the sister was job hunting or not is irrelevant to the contractual lease. It's hard for us to look at it, and it's hard for us to want to admit that, but it really is irrelevant. If the sister wants to sit in her nap on the couch all day long, you allowed her into the house, you have a lease that says they're supposed to pay this much rent, then what the sister chooses to do with her day is actually irrelevant. Another Reddit user said, you aren't threatening, you are having healthy rules and boundaries. You are giving them an entirely reasonable choice, pay rent, contribute another way, or have a different living situation. There's nothing wrong with that. And good for you for setting up that lease. That was an extremely smart move. Yes and no. The lease was a smart move as far as your intention was to protect yourself legally from having a moocher or a bum living at your place. But it was not a smart move in the lack of enforcing the lease. And the lease lacked enforcement through the non-payment of rent. You can sit there, we can sit there and say, they're bummy, they're scummy, how come, they're both not working and all of this. We can do that till the cows come home. But the bottom line is a lease was broken, and it was broken by the Redditor, not by the in-laws that are living there. However, other users were not on the woman's side, with one writing, yeah, but she tricked them. She didn't collect their lease payment just so she'd have cause to evict them. How deceitful. Okay, but again, okay, yeah, that was a bit, her intention was to kind of, like I said, hide the lease in the back pocket and throw it in their face when they wanted them out. But when you really get down to it, okay, this is one of those rare cases where I would have to say the tenants are correct, only in that the tenants did not break the lease. The landlord did, that being the Redditor. And if the Redditor does not like the lease, does not like the terms of it, then the Redditor should have thought twice before she allowed the in-laws to move in to begin with.